Good morning and welcome to today's webinar on crafting a credible climate transition plan. My name is Lynn. I'm a consultant at Nordic Sustainability, and I am honored to be your moderator today. I can see the participants are rolling in, so I'm going to take this opportunity to also kickstart our session. As we jump into the topic of climate transition plans, it's important to recognize the major shift that they have undergone from being a largely voluntary item on companies' to-do list to becoming a top priority for European businesses today. To help us navigate this crucial change, I am joined by two wonderful speakers, Ole and Alexander. Ole is a principal and climate lead at Nordic Sustainability, who is a seasoned expert in climate strategy, having guided so many companies, both Nordic and global, in developing ambitious plans for achieving net zero. Ole is bringing extensive knowledge and hands-on experience to the table, from creating GHG inventories, setting science-based targets, or even building detailed climate transition plans. Super happy to have you here, Ole.
Thank you.
And also our second speaker is Alexander. He is a sustainability manager for road at DSV's Global Transport and Logistics. He leads the road decarbonization program. So we're having frontline insights of sustainable logistics. He's bringing some invaluable insights from his lessons from DSV's building and implementation of a successful climate transition plan. Thank you for joining us, Alexander.
Thank you.
Now, before we dive into this exciting agenda that we've got lined up for you today, I have a very quick word on technicalities. This webinar is being recorded, and the recording, along with all of the slides that you're going to see throughout this presentation, will be sent to you afterwards in case you want to review the content later. We will also have a very nice Q&A session. If you look at the bottom of your Zoom window, there is a Q&A button, and feel free to submit all of your burning questions at any point during our conversation, and we will make sure to answer as much as we can. Now, without further ado, I will hand on my mic to Ole, our first speaker today.
Thank you so much, Lynn, for that very nice introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this morning. It's super, super nice that you have tuned in and are interested in hearing what we have to say about climate transition plans here today. So today we are going to talk a lot about climate transition plans here. We are going to be talking about what it is and what goes into a climate transition plan. We are going to talk about how you build one, and finally, how you implement one, before Alexander is going to give us some very real insight from his daily work doing just that at DSV Road here. So let's jump in. But first, just a very, very few words about Nordic Sustainability. Nordic Sustainability, we are a sustainability strategy consultancy. We are all about accelerating business transformation, and our vision is a society where companies succeed and people thrive within planetary boundaries. I myself is the climate lead in Nordic Sustainability, and for the past 9 years, I've been working with corporate climate action both in a climate change focused NGO based in London called the Climate Group, and also in a small circular economy consultancy, and then for the last 5 years here in Nordic Sustainability. Yes, so that's a little bit about me and us here, but let's talk about climate transition plans here. And the first thing that we need to cover is what a climate transition plan is. But before we speak about that, it's also really important to understand why it is that we need one here. And unfortunately, then 2024 was a dire reminder of the need to really make action on climate change and start reducing those greenhouse gas emissions. It was the hottest year to date. And unfortunately, we did break this 1.5-degree barrier that we've been speaking so much about here in the past. It was boosted by a powerful El Niño event here. So we are not saying that we can't limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, but we are getting dangerously close. And the effects of that is becoming increasingly apparent. We saw Hurricane Helene back in September of 2024 that caused 219 deaths and almost $80 billion in disaster money here. Vietnam saw its most powerful cyclone since it started recording it, and Malaysia experienced the worst flood in decades here. So the effects of climate change are very real. They're devastating to people, and they're also getting very, very expensive, which really tells us that now is the time to do something about this before it gets too expensive. But there are also other reasons to start focusing on creating a climate transition plan here, because we are being pushed, many companies are being pushed from the outside to start developing them. And there's both something that's coming from the EU legislative landscape and something that's coming from pressures from our value chain. In the legislative arena here, we have two pieces of legislation that most European companies will know very well by now. One of them is the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, or CSRD, and the other one is the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, or CSDDD here. Both of these pieces of legislation requires most companies of a certain size to develop climate transition plans. On the other side, when we look at the pressure that we can get from our customers, then more than 10,000 companies have now committed to set science-based targets here, and more than 7,000 companies have gotten their targets validated already by the Science Based Targets Initiative here. And in order for these 7,000 to 10,000 companies to succeed, then they will need the companies in their value chain to take action on reducing their emissions as well here. So the clear expectation is that during 2025, then most companies will see many more requirements to report on their greenhouse gas emissions and reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. So therefore, developing a credible climate transition plan in 2025 is going to be a key priority for a lot of companies. So what is a climate transition plan then? Well, a climate transition plan is unfortunately not just one thing. It would be wonderful just to say that this is what it is, job done here. But unfortunately, it can be in many shapes or forms here. But now, because so many companies need to report on their climate transition plan through CSRD here, I thought that it would make a lot of sense to go through some of the requirements that CSRD put to climate transition plans, so you get a little bit more of an understanding of what is it that actually needs to go into these climate transition plans here. And there are 10 elements. I know that there's only 9 on screen, but there was most space for 9 symbols here. So that's a reason. And 2 of them are very closely linked. So this is why it looks the way that it does. But the first things that companies need to do is to make sure that their greenhouse gas emission reduction targets are aligned with 1.5 degrees here. And this can be, of course, a challenging thing to do here. How do you say that a certain amount of reductions is aligned with a 1.5 degree pathway here? But typically what you do is that you look on various emissions reductions scenarios and what temperature that will lead to. And then based on that, you figure out how much you need to reduce your emissions by. And fortunately, then Science Based Targets Initiative has already developed a good methodology for how ambitious targets needs to be in order to be 1.5 degree aligned. So our recommendation is to follow Science-Based Targets methodology, and then you can be quite certain that your targets is aligned with 1.5 degrees. So that's number 1. Once you have your target, then you need to make sure that you identify the right decarbonization levers and the right actions to actually make progress on your target, to actually achieve your target here. And we will be speaking much more about that in how to build a climate transition plan a little bit later. That's the same with the investments and funding to support the climate transition plan. But here I will say here that when you develop a climate transition plan, then until it gets funding, it's just a piece of paper. It costs money to reduce emissions. It can also save money in some instances, but in order to get it over, to get it started, then some funding is required. And therefore, it's a very, very smart thing to include thoughts about investments and funding when you develop your climate transition plan. It's also very smart to recognize that even though there's a lot of things that a company might like to do, then there are some things that they can't do immediately. They might have an existing car fleet already that is fossil-based, where they're not prepared to change the cars until later. They might have buildings where they've just bought a new gas boiler and are not prepared to change that gas boiler to a heat pump or the likes. Or they might sell products that is running on fossil fuels and they haven't got the technology in order to transition to an electricity-driven product or the likes here. So there's many sources of emissions that can be locked and difficult to change in the short term. And this is something that we need to think about when we develop our climate transition plans. CSRD is also very closely linked to CSDDD, but it's also closely linked to the EU taxonomy. And here, CSRD is asking for companies to report that if their climate transition plan brings further alignment with the EU taxonomy, then you also report on this here. And then comes these two here that is quite closely aligned, where companies, one of the key things that is stopping the world from achieving our overall climate targets is our heavy reliance on fossil fuels. So companies are asked first to report whether they have significant investments in coal, oil, and natural gas. And then they're also asked to report on whether they're excluded from the EU Paris-aligned benchmarks. And basically what that means in the simplest terms is that if a company is making a certain proportion of its revenue from coal, oil, natural gas, or electricity with quite a high emissions intensity, then they can be excluded from EU Paris-aligned benchmarks. And therefore, that needs to be reported. And then come an extremely exciting one, in my opinion here, because sometimes the actions of a climate transition plan can be different than the actions of the normal corporate strategy. And this is, of course, obvious. We're not doing exactly the same thing in a climate transition plan and in a company's day-to-day work here. But sometimes the activities are actually going in opposite directions here. And then it can be a little bit difficult for a climate transition plan to battle the overall goals of the overall business strategy and the overall financial planning. Therefore, when developing the climate transition plan, it's important to recognize here if there are areas where the strategy is going in a different direction than the climate transition plan. So you can deal with that upfront. In order for a climate transition plan to be properly successful, then it needs to have support and approval by the senior leadership in the organization. So we need to report on whether that is the case. And then finally, going forward, we also need to report on the progress that we are making on the climate transition plan year on year. So this is the content of a climate transition plan in CSRD terms here. And I think that it is a some very smart things to report on here. And then the golden question is then, of course, how do we actually do it? How do we develop it? And that is the content of the next stage here. I would say that what we have seen in the past, and I think where a lot of companies are, is that they have developed some quite ambitious GHG reduction targets. But many haven't really developed this climate transition plan yet. So like using this framework to build it to start with is quite a good idea. Many companies have also, other companies have actually built a climate transition plan, but have maybe focused on some elements of a climate transition plan. And I think what the CSRD is really trying to do here is that we really recognize upfront how fit for purpose our climate transition plan in terms of achieving our GHG emissions reduction targets. So this is a good framework for building the climate transition plan. And then let's talk a little bit about how one does that. It's important to recognize that the climate transition plan is not the entire climate journey that a company is going to go on. There's quite a few things that a climate transition plan needs to be built on in order to be worthwhile, in order to be good and successful and smart. And then there's quite a few things that needs to happen afterwards in order for you to actually see the results of a climate transition plan. So the first thing that all companies need to have is a good greenhouse gas inventory that covers scope 1, 2, and 3. If the company has not got a greenhouse gas inventory yet, then it's the wrong place to start with a climate transition plan. The right place would then be to first build this greenhouse gas inventory here. If you don't know where your emissions hotspots are, it's very, very difficult to focus your attention in your climate transition plan. The second thing that a company needs to do is then to build a greenhouse gas emissions reductions target that the climate transition plan can help you achieve. It's also our strong recommendation to really understand the climate-related risks that you have, because that also help you prioritize the activities in the climate transition plan. So there will be some physical risks from climate change that some of your value chain or maybe country locations have to deal with. But there might also be transition risk where, for instance, in the EU, then we might be moving a little bit faster on legislation, for example, which might come at a cost to companies if they're not aligned in the EU. So that way, understanding the transition risks helps you prioritize where to take your actions first. Good. Once you've done these things, then you can develop your transition plan. When that is done, then it needs to be implemented. And this can't be said enough. A climate transition plan is just a piece of paper until it gets implemented. So how you typically do it is that you need to operationalize the plan. And here you need to ensure that you have the right governance structure. You make various teams responsible for parts of the plan. It will typically be the sustainability department that develops a lot of the climate transition plan, or a strategy department that develops a lot of the climate transition plan. But the people who's actually going to make it happen sits out in the organization. So making sure that they have targets and the right incentives to make progress on this is important. I'll get back to that a little bit more. Then we also need to make sure that the underlying foundation in the organization support the achievement of the climate transition plan. Most companies are built on a set of policies or standard operating procedures and existing staff knowledge and the likes. And if you have certain policies or standard operating procedures that does not allow you to make progress on a climate transition plan, then of course that's problematic. So a good review of existing policies and standard operating procedures where you have your emission hotspots is an important thing to do, and making sure that your staff is capable of taking action on your climate transition plan is also important. Once you have this right setup here, then you're in a really, really good position to take action on the initiatives that you have developed in your climate transition plan here. But chances are that the climate transition plan is not going to be perfect the first time you make it here. You're going to learn a lot. There's some things that's going to be more effective and some things that's not going to be nearly as effective as you thought. So you will then have to adapt your climate transition plan again and again and again. And then at the end of it, you will get to the point where you achieve net zero emissions before 2050. Good. So the two most important things in a climate transition plan, in my opinion here, is the identification of decarbonization levers and adequate action and resource planning. So when you are prioritizing and thinking about, okay, I still don't fully understand what this climate transition plan is, then if you get to a point where you really understand which main things that you can do in order to reduce your emissions and identify specific actions and allocate resources to those actions, then you're a long way towards developing a good climate transition plan here. And first, on the identification of decarbonization levers, we have proposed 3 main things that you should do before you can then decide on which decarbonization levers to prioritize. First, you need to understand and prioritize your emission hotspots. You need to understand a little bit about the mechanics of how GHG accounting works. And then you need to understand your specific limitations and opportunities in the company that you are to make the right assessment about what can you most effectively do something about. And when you need to prioritize your emission hotspots, you are dependent on having this good greenhouse gas inventory here. Most companies, I think it's more than 90% of companies are using the greenhouse gas protocol, and most of the legislation that we've been speaking about previously is also asking you to report in line with the greenhouse gas protocol. So this is a really, really good place to start here. The more you know about what's big and what's small for your company in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, the easier it becomes to identify the sources of emissions that you want to be focusing on. So this is key for identifying the right decarbonization levers. The second thing, oh, sorry, that jumped a little bit. The second thing that you need to do is to understand the mechanics of greenhouse gas accounting. And there are a lot going into this, but two really key things to take away is that when we are calculating the emissions from, for example, steel, then understanding the amount of steel that you purchase in order to produce your products is one element that something can be done about. The other part that can be done about is the emissions intensity of the steel or whatever activity that it might actually be here. So every single activity that companies does will likely have a GHG, some GHG emissions assigned to it here. So understanding both the amount of the activity and the GHG intensity of that activity is really crucial for identifying the right decarbonization levers here. And especially when it comes to understanding the emissions intensity of an activity here, then you can go into a lot of depth. You can, an emission factor, which is what it's called to calculate the emissions intensity of an activity, is based on a whole lot of different things. So it's based on a lot of transportation down in your supply chain. It's based on production methods in your supply chain. And the more you understand about this, the more specific and precise you can be about which activities that you use, which levers that you have in order to reduce your emissions. Good. Then finally, you need to understand your own situation a little bit more. If you are a big company, for instance, and have smaller suppliers, then there's a good chance that your suppliers will be highly dependent on you as a company here, and that will mean that you have quite a bit of influence over your key suppliers. So if you ask your suppliers to make a change, then there's a higher likelihood that they will do it than if you are a relatively small company using a very, very big supplier where you are responsible for a very small part of their revenue. You might also be in a sector where that is highly, where each product that gets sold is totally dependent on price. The cheapest product gets sold. There it can be more difficult to buy materials at a little bit of a premium to get a more sustainable material. Whereas if you're selling a premium product already here, where price is not completely based on the cost of the production of the product here, then you have more flexibility to make your product more sustainable going forwards. So there's various elements that goes into understanding where it is you are as a company here, and doing that is a really, really effective way of understanding which decarbonization levers are most effective. So when you have done these three things, you should be able to ask yourself this question: what are all the realistic ways we can reduce both the amount and the emissions intensity of our emission hotspots? When you can answer this question, you're in a good position to have your decarbonization levers. The second part is now we understand our decarbonization levers. We understand that, for example, if we're heavily reliant on steel, then by reducing our steel consumption or reducing the emissions intensity of the steel that we are using becomes a really, really effective way of reducing our emissions. But just knowing that this is effective does not reduce emissions by itself. You need to plan specific actions in order to actually get it out in the real world here. And here, the process of getting from a decarbonization lever to some good actions here is we recommend these 4 steps here, and then a replication of the process here if you don't get far enough. First, it's engaging with the relevant stakeholders to identify the right initiatives. Then it is to get more information about the initiatives that you have prioritized. Then it is and use that to develop some mini project plans that can then be approved. then it is to calculate the decarbonization potential of these initiatives and understand the investment needs. And then you are in a really good place to then start taking action on the identified activities. But let's dive a little bit closer into those here. One of the key and most important parts here is, again, that the people who is going to take action on the initiatives is not going to be the sustainability department. It is going to be product owners. It's going to be people from research and development or procurement or facility managers or fleet managers or HR even. Like, depending on your decarbonization activity, then like action will sit many places in your organization, and they know their job better than sustainability department will typically do. So therefore, it's really, really important to engage with these stakeholders relatively early on to understand their specific context and understand both the opportunities and limitations that they're sitting with in order to get the most effective decarbonization initiative. On the other hand, then it's also really important for them to understand that this is not a voluntary thing. Now the company has set an ambitious climate target. They are developing a climate transition plan in order to achieve that target. And these people are hugely crucial for making this a success. So therefore, it's really important to understand that some parts of their work will likely change here, but they can be part of making this happen. Once we're there, we're in a good position to then have several workshops to understand a little bit more about which specific opportunities and boundaries do we have to reduce emissions within the areas that the people are working on, that we are speaking to in these workshops here. That should lead us to a really nice set of initiatives, and then we're in a good position to then prioritize the initiatives that will give us most bang for our buck. The initiatives that we then end up prioritizing, we should get a little bit more information about, because at this stage, it is still just a list of various initiatives that could potentially have an effect. But in order for them to come to life, then we need to know more about them. So we need to start building some mini project plans and understand a little bit more. Typical things to go into it is like a description of what the initiative is, how it will actually reduce emissions, how much the emissions will be reduced by, when the emissions will be reduced by, and the activities happen, and finally the financial implications of the initiative. There's no set way of creating these mini project plans here, but our recommendation is that you try and keep it short, because you will likely have to develop a lot of them. You will develop them in partnership with the ones who will carry out the initiatives, and then making sure that it follows the same structure for project plans when you need to get approval for them is also a very smart thing to do. And as you heard, then two of the key elements in this here is to understand the decarbonization potential of the activity and to understand the cost of the activity. So I thought I'd just dive into that just a little bit more. And calculating the decarbonization potential of an initiative can be easy if the initiative that is suggested is relatively straightforward, but it can also be quite complicated. So typically what we have to do in order to calculate the decarbonization potential is we need to make a lot of assumptions about the initiative. There's first something about like which emission source in the company does it target. It could, for example, be the amount of steel that the company is procuring, which could be, for example, 20% of overall Scope 3 emissions. Then if the initiative is to reduce steel from a certain product group, then we need to understand how much of the total steel that we are buying in this company sits within this specific product group. That could be 50% of the overall steel production. And then finally, we need to understand how much this initiative will actually reduce emissions in the end, which could be like, let's say, 10 to 30%. Now you have a lot of assumptions here. And when you start multiplying these numbers here, then you get to a place where you understand the total decarbonization potential of the initiative. Quite often, it will be a range dependent on how successful we are in actually reducing these emissions here. But that is also okay. But this is what we are trying to get to. The other part of it is that we need to understand the investment needs related to each of these activities here. And here it's important to work with traditional financial indicators such as CapEx and OpEx. But my strong recommendation here is also to think about the upside of some of these initiatives. It does make it easier to get approval for various initiatives. So if you can take into consideration some financial benefits that you could get from having a reduced risk because you are selling products with a lower CO2 intensity, and that could be one thing. You might save money on having to buy less materials, or you might even see increased sales from selling more attractive products. Sometimes it can be really challenging to calculate the investment needs for an initiative, especially if it's an initiative with a really high decarbonization potential, because that will often be a very complex project to do. So, for instance, if we are thinking about creating a take-back system in order to resell old products when they've reached the end of life with their customers, then you need to have an understanding about this related cost of taking the logistics of getting the products back from your customers. You need to understand the cost of setting up potential repairs. You need to understand whether the market is even ready to buy more of these reused products here. So it can be a very, very complex thing to do, but unfortunately then where you typically see the highest decarbonization potential is also sometimes where it is quite complex projects. And in order to not just get these projects discarded here because they're too complex and it's too difficult to put a number on the investment needs here, then I would really recommend that you work on the approval methods here. So try and work a little bit with gates. So you say like, okay, the first thing is that we need to have a proof of concept here. And we have now analyzed that we can get this far. Then you get your first approval, and then you can do a little bit more analysis before you finally get to the stage where you get full approval for the project here. Good. Okay. Chances are that this process here will give you a lot of initiatives that you can work on in order to reduce your emissions. You might be in a really, really good situation where everything is covered. And you, with the climate transition plan you have all of the initiatives that you need in order to achieve your target. But you might also be in a situation where it turns out that the initiatives that you have identified does not take you far enough. It still makes a lot of sense to try and get started with the initiatives that you've already developed. But in order for your climate transition plan to be adequate, then you do need to then go back and identify more initiatives or make sure that the effect that you get for your existing initiatives are as effective as possible. Good. I hope that gave some kind of idea about how you actually build the climate transition plan. And I can see that I'm running out of time a little bit here, so I will go through the implementation of the climate transition plan a little bit faster so we can get to the really exciting part that Alexander is also responsible for here. But how do you implement a climate transition plan? The first thing that I thought would be worthwhile to cover here is that we need to recognize a few facts about what it means to actually transition towards a lower CO2 organization here. It will come with a little bit of cost here initially, and you won't see the financial benefits of some of your initiatives directly and maybe not for a while. So initially, like being prepared that it comes at a little bit of cost is good to recognize. It's also important to recognize that this will take time. You won't just reduce all of your emissions and be net zero tomorrow. Some of this will take a lot of planning and a lot of time to actually happen here. So it's a long journey that we are on, and most companies will be working on this for the next 25 years here. It's also worthwhile mentioning that traditional success metrics, just like selling as much as possible in every single area, might not be fully aligned with the climate transition plan here. You should still be able to sell more, of course, but it might be that you're selling more of one thing and a little bit less of another thing if there's a low CO2 intensity in the former and a high CO2 intensity in the latter. But the final thing that is really, really good to recognize is this thing here, that the people who's carrying out the work is not the sustainability department, it's not the sustainability experts here. And these people who is carrying out the work, who sits in procurement and R&D and various other places here, they might lack the necessary knowledge, time, or incentives to succeed. And therefore, when we are implementing the climate transition plan, we really need to start dealing with that. So the short recommendation here when you are implementing the climate transition plan is ensure that you divide responsibility for it. So the people who is actually going to make it happen also own the climate transition plan. You can do that quite effectively by translating the overall target to some very department-specific targets. E.g., that could, for example, be that instead of asking a facility manager to reduce CO2 emissions by a certain proportion, you can ask them to change gas boilers to heat pumps before a certain year. Then you need to make sure that they're properly incentivized and have the right KPIs in order to take action on your climate transition plan. And finally, you need to ensure that the underlying policies and procedures that your work is built on support, or at least does not hinder the climate transition plan. I'm sorry that was a little bit quick. We have a lot more to say about this, but in the interest of time, then I want to just give you the 3 main key takeaways from this here. So if you are to remember 3 key things, then please remember that if you haven't started it yet, then 2025 is the year to develop a climate transition plan. 2, the most important things to focus on in a climate transition plan is to really understand and prioritize some decarbonization levers, and then underlying actions and funding in order to get maximum potential out of your decarbonization levers. And then finally here, a climate transition plan is not going to have any effect unless it's implemented properly. So do not think that your work is done once you've done the climate transition plan. Ensure that there's a good plan for how to make it become real afterwards. That was it from me. Thank you so much for listening. I hope it was useful.
Now we're handing over the mic to Alexander. Thank you so much, Ole. Alexander is going to give us a bit more insight into how it looks like really in the playground of logistics and transportation. Alexander?
Sure. Thank you, and thank you for inviting me and letting me and DSV share some of our learnings. We unveiled our roadmap or climate transition plan a year ago. So we have a year's worth of experience on actually executing that roadmap and some of the learnings I would like to share with you today. So maybe if you, Ole, could jump to the next slide. Exactly. So how do you measure a company? Well, today it might be most relevant to look at our emissions. And as a transport and logistics company, as one of the world's biggest transport and logistics provider, we are, of course, a big contributor to emissions globally. You can see here our carbon footprint is approximately 12 million tons of CO2. But you can also see that if there's a very, very small portion from DSV's own operation, our scope 1 and 2, the vast portion of our emissions is from our sub-suppliers, our hauliers, our carriers, all throughout the world. That is mainly because DSV is an asset-light company that relies heavily on these subcontractors. So that is our main task at hand, to engage with our subcontractors, trying to get them on board with this transition and reducing their emissions. So what we did was, well, very much what Ole highlighted. We tried to identify what are the possible actions we can do in DSV in order to reduce our emissions. We have a science-based target for 2030 and 2050. For 2030, it is to reduce our scope 1 and 2 emissions by 50%, but much more important, to reduce our sub-suppliers' emissions by 30%. And we actually try to translate those numbers into vehicles. So that is what we operate with in DSV, especially in the road division I'm working with. And we try to translate how many trucks of different kinds of technologies do we need to deploy in the next 5 years in order to achieve these targets. And that you can see in the left corner in the blue box there. It translates to just around 300 zero and low emission vehicles last year and this year. So the deadline is nearing, but then increasing that share to more than 2,000 battery electric trucks by the end of this decade. And then for the part of our activities where it's very hard to deploy some of these technologies due to, the maturity of the technology, range limitations, all this, then we're focusing on instead making our other activities much more efficient, that we do with approximately 5,000 what we call best-in-class diesel trucks. So very tangible numbers. It's very clear. That is what we need to achieve. That is what we need to deploy on the roads in the next 5 years. Then we also identified some main levers. Some main levers and themes. You could say this is what is really within our sphere of influence, what we can do something without and not rely so heavily on external factors. That is using our groupage network where we have fixed routes across the world. It is to look at distribution, city zero emission zones in cities like, well, it could be Copenhagen. We see a lot in the Netherlands, all these kind. That's the easy first steps where policies makers are forcing us to do something anyhow. And then, of course, the last bit, a whole engagement to figure out what do we need to do in order to make it easier for our subcontractors to transition as well. And now you can jump to the next one. So for 2024, our main task has been to establish a foundation that makes it possible for us to execute and accelerate the deployment of zero-emission trucks at a very high speed. And what that means is that we need to make it easy for our freight forwarders to choose a low or zero-emission technology without having to think too much about it. And that is what we've been focusing on. It's not something that creates the big headlines, not something you see a lot about. A lot of what you work with is beneath the surface. It is to make those changes within the organization so it becomes much more efficient to deploy these technologies and doesn't impact your key strengths on the market as well. If we could jump to the next one. Translating our reductions to actual number of trucks also means that it is easier for us to hand out specific KPIs for our local departments. And that is exactly what we've done. We monitor the local policy framework, the conditions, the taxes, the potential investments that the government is also willing to do to identify the key markets. And in these key markets, you can see highlighted here, we then handed out specific KPIs for each one of them, saying by the end of 2025, you need this amount of electric trucks, this amount of best-in-class diesel trucks. For some of the countries, it could also be biogas trucks or something similar to that, to translate that to very tangible KPIs for each country. That is their task at hand. They need to achieve that. And that is how we very much work with it, both for last year and this year, and in the coming 5 years. And then on the next slide, you can see we, as a light company, there's a lot of factors we really can't influence. I mean, the availability of grid infrastructure or public charging infrastructure, renewable energy, all this is very hard for DSV to do anything about. But we are very reliant on it, especially when subcontractors play such a huge role in our activities. So we try to look at how can we make it easier for our hauliers to engage and try to make this transition with us. And here is an example, a very concrete example, where DSV has used it enterprise size to negotiate with manufacturers, trying to clear a pathway where we get better prices for very expensive assets, where we can provide our subcontractors with more competitive solutions. That is what we've done with Volvo in a joint commitment, signed a letter of intent to deploy 300 battery electric trucks by 2026, and also parts of our best-in-class trucks. So we use our size in order to try to negotiate deals that is both good for, well, partners like Volvo, good for DSV, but also good for our subcontractors. We, of course, can also do something about charging infrastructure at our own sites. DSV is a large company. We had a lot of sites, warehouses, terminals all across the world. Land that we can use to deploy charging infrastructure and make that available for subcontractors as well. So we realized that this was a key lever both for the road division, but also for other divisions in order to execute on our strategy. So we established a company within a company, DSV Energy, that is responsible of setting up solar power panel, creating renewable energy at our own sites, and also using that renewable energy, deploying charging infrastructure, and making sure that our subcontractors can charge their new vehicles at our site when they are having a pause there anyhow, and utilize this renewable energy that we can produce ourselves. I think on the next slide is a concrete example of this. Last year, we opened up one of the world's biggest facilities. And as far as I know, it is the biggest solar power panel on a rooftop available that produces a lot of energy, more than we can actually use. We then provide or sell the rest of the energy to the local grid. But it also means that we are able to actually produce the energy ourselves, set up charging infrastructure, and then reduce our reliance on external factors and framework conditions. And that was a speed run from me on our actions.
That is wonderful. Thank you so much for this dose of climate knowledge right at breakfast. And thank you for sharing your expertise and your thought-provoking insights, Ole and Alexander. And now I think we've covered quite a lot of ground, the three of us. Maybe it's time to hear from our participants. We're opening the floor up to the Q&A session now. This is your chance to engage with the panelists, dive deeper into the topics that you really want answers to. No question is too big or too small, and I see that all of the questions have been rolling in throughout the webinar, so I'm just gonna pick a couple of them, and maybe Ole, you can help me figure out an appropriate answer. Is that okay?
Of course.
I have one question here. The first one is, what are some key steps to creating a strong business case for securing approval from the board or the management?
I definitely have something to say on this one here, but I don't know, Alexander, do you have anything that you would like to put to this answer before I start?
I think our experience is very clear that as you also highlighted, Ole, a lot of these solutions are costly right now. So there is also our experience is to really monitor local framework conditions and how we foresee that changing in the future, so we can lay out the risks and opportunity very, very clearly and be very honest about that. I choose personally also to be a bit on a conservative side, not to overpromise. But that has, at least from us, proven quite effective, to really deep dive into what are the local conditions, what can we expect, and how does that impact the investments that we need to do here, and then have that clearly laid out. I think in all parts of the business, there's always risks. So choosing the right pathway is always depending on you having that clarity over what is the risks, what can we impact, and what can we not impact.
I think that's a super good answer, and that's also the same line I would go down at. And I think one of the things that I would also really highlight here is that, at least my experience is that in some companies we do tend to have a very clear focus on the costs of the initiative. But typically when we think about the cost or the financial implications of an initiative, we think about what is the situation at the time when the initiative is going to be implemented or approved, right? But quite often then these initiatives, they do mitigate risk in some sense or form here. And especially like when you start playing with the thought that we might actually have carbon taxation coming in the future, right? Like then the cost of the initiative, it is something today, but it also mitigates the risk of having increased carbon pricing going forwards, right? Like, so there's really both taking into consideration that there is some upfront OPEX and CAPEX, but this can also be cost saving going forward. And then I completely agree with Alexander that of course you shouldn't overpromise anything here, but it's also a shame if we are only focusing on the cost of various things here. And then I do also think that it's worth highlighting that that we are seeing that a lot of companies are in their tender requirements when they're bidding for projects or the likes, or when they are signing contracts with other companies, that then there are an increasing amount of ESG requirements when it is that they're winning their contracts. And I think here I had a chance to speak to Alexander a little bit beforehand, right? Like the suppliers of DSV also have to live up to certain sustainability requirements here, right? Like so when it is that you're making the case to your management and your board, then definitely bring forward the cost, but definitely also that it can help you win more contracts and it can help you avoid some future costs.
That is wonderful. Thank you for answering this question, both of you. And I see that there's quite a few questions that are lining up, but you managed to answer them in the process of this one. I think maybe going a bit more in a practical way, there is a question here regarding the climate transition plans in terms of where do we start? What's a good place to start? Is it using a system? What should we do as a beginning sustainability department?
Yeah, here I'd love to hear your thoughts as well, Alexander. Where do you start? Do you start with a system, or do you start in Excel, or do you start somewhere else?
But I would have, love to say that we had a very clear system all carved out. We knew exactly how to proceed with this and what we needed and all that, but that would simply not be the truth. I think there's a lot of learning here, right? And we learned a lot in the past years where we developed this. As I said, we tried, because for us it's really about in the road divisions, trucks. In our A&C division, it's about carriers. In our solution division, it's about warehouses. So trying to identify what are the technologies and trying to translate that. So for the road part, trying to figure out what I mean, one thing is a percentage of reductions. Another thing is, what does this mean in terms of actual numbers of vehicles I need to have deployed? And here comes a lot of assumptions, like you mentioned, Ole, because there's a lot of this that's uncertain. How much can a battery electric truck actually reduce if we factor in local, energy emission factors? Where do we charge all this? And it's simply something you don't really know at the beginning, but you will only get that information once you start deploying. So you have to make some assumptions about this. So there's very much from our part, at least, that trying to make this plan overall, but also being, again, back to honesty and clear that this is not the end result. I mean, we're going to have to update this periodically. We've made a simulation tools where we can put in the different assumptions about the trucks and the reduction they can provide, and then see, okay, how does this changes? And we update this, each half year with new learnings to see how does this impact our roadmap. So also in the way we communicate it internally and externally, nothing is set in stone. The only thing that we know for sure we need to achieve is the 50% reduction and the 30% reduction. But the pathway there can change, the market change, the technology change. If suddenly battery electric trucks, for example, mature really more than we expected, then of course we have to factor that in and change our roadmap to take into that account. So I mean, we don't have a clear plan set out from the beginning. It's a plan that is developing also when we get more learnings. But we have some pathway. We have some overview of where we need to go in order to achieve this.
And I think from my point of view here, then I think if the question is also very related to this, do you need to have a system to start? Can that be beneficial for you? Then I think that there's a growing amount of systems out there, right? Like that gives recommendations and help you. But I don't think we have necessarily found the one system to conquer them all. And I also think like that, as you heard when I described the process of how to build a climate transition plan, then so much of the work is not something that a system can do for you. It is really you engaging with your internal stakeholders to understand what are the various opportunities and limitations that they're facing here, understanding your specific context here. And this is not something that a system can help you with. So it might be that at some point it becomes the right thing in order for you to keep track of all of the various initiatives and the combined decarbonization potential. And maybe you can also find something that gives you a little bit of inspiration. But it's like, I don't think that this should be the first step for you, that you go out and try and find a system. The first step for you here should really be to start understanding what are your opportunities, where can you most easily start reducing your emissions.
Thank you so much, Ole and Alexander, for your answers. I guess engagement and adaptability are the two values, the North Stars of any climate transition plan and climate strategy in general. And I think this is kind of a good question to continue with, that kind of, it doesn't really exactly tie in, but I think it's related a little bit to the notion of sustainability on a bureaucratic, systematic level. And here's a question that I would like you to answer. What is the value of having the transition plan as a separate publication as opposed to having it weaved into the annual sustainability report, especially now with the CSRD and the CDP, asking for disclosure on its main components? What do you have in mind about this?
Question.
It's a loaded one too.
Do you want to start, Alexander?
Oh, no, maybe you can start. I'll just gather my line of thoughts here.
Yes, of course. So I think our experience is, and what we hear from some of the auditing companies that we are speaking to here, is that you're asked to report on the various elements of climate transition plans in your annual report as part of CSRD, for example. But this needs to be approved by your auditors. And in order to ensure that it is as easy as possible to get approval, it needs to be simple and easily understandable for the auditors to do. The more complex you make it, the more difficult it is to get this approval sometimes. So in an annual report, at least when you are aligning it to CSRD criteria and when you need to get this limited assurance of it, then simplicity can be key. But in order to create a plan that is actually well thought through, and where you cover your bases, where you think about like what are the various eventualities that could come up here, then there is a lot of value in developing a more complex climate transition plan. And I think the example here about using various assumptions to calculate the decarbonization potential of a climate transition plan is a good example, because one initiative is not necessarily going to reduce emissions by a certain amount here. It is based on a lot of assumptions. And if you create a framework where you list all of your assumptions, where you say like this could reduce emissions by anything from 10 to 30% or 10 to 40% or whatever that might be, then the more knowledge and understanding you get of this further down the line, the more then you can go in and change your assumptions, right? Like then you can go and really build a much more comprehensive climate transition plan that's so much easier to work with and gives you a much more real idea about how it is that you're going to achieve your targets. So I think it is this battle between simplicity and complexity here, and I think with or not complexity, comprehensiveness. And I think with a more comprehensive climate transition plan, you also have a much better chance of achieving a climate target.
I think one of the key strengths is also that I think you, Ole, said the buzzword most bang for the buck, right? Have the most efficient plan here. And that's I think a big value of having an actual transition plan, where you have a view as to where are the low-hanging fruits. Because, I mean, in all honesty, why would you go for the highest one from the beginning if you can make an efficient, reductions right here, right now in the cheapest way? So identifying that, I think very concretely for DSV, we have bridge technologies. I mentioned best-in-class diesel truck. Biofuels could also be a possibility, but I think all know this is not a tangible solution in the long run. If we need to achieve net zero, we need a whole different technology, battery technology, for example. But that is a technology that's very expensive right now. So figuring out, do you go all in for the bridge technologies now, then knowing you have a very, very big job at the later stage to set up charging infrastructure, to get know-how about the technology and all this? Or do you try to mix it a bit where you make sure that you get some know-how, actually try the technology, establish the foundation as I showed earlier, and then you're ready to really accelerate once the technology then reaches a maturity level? And we try to find that pathway. And that, I think, is also one of the strengths, in addition to what you mentioned, Ole, of course, to having this plan right, figuring out where can I do something right here, right now, without setting my competitiveness at risk, but actually strengthen it, but also keeping an eye on what do I need to achieve in the later part of it.
What a wonderful answer. I think this is, for me, especially as a consultant, I feel like there's a lot to be taken from this view of starting on a grassroots level and then working your way up, trying to find the low-hanging fruits. Thank you so much to both of you. I see that we are just a tiny bit over time, and I would love it if we can continue this conversation perhaps in the email that we send later on to the people who have attended, along with the recording and the slides that we have created for them today. Is that okay with you? Yep. Fantastic. Well, then this is the end of our session today. I hope that you've gotten as much possible out of this conversation that Ole and Alexander have had. And we are sorry if we didn't manage to answer your questions, but we'll try to get back to you with an answer in our email one of these coming days. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander, for participating.
Thank you. Have a good day.